Adventurous audio. From idea to ear.
What if a conversation about suicide could save a life? That life might be a friend, a family member, a loved one. So how would you start it? It's tough, isn't it? What words will you use? A new campaign from Suicide Prevention Scotland wants us to do exactly that, start the conversation. It's a campaign aimed at normalising the idea of talking about suicide and giving people, you and me, the confidence to do so. Because here's the thing. Talking about suicide is the best way to prevent it. It's one of the things we are always trying to encourage all of us to do on speaking of suicide. Today I'm talking to Haylis Smith. Haylis is the National Delivery Lead for Suicide Prevention Scotland. She's the one leading this campaign, which is based around people's lived experiences of suicide, and it's something that sits very closely to her own heart. But just before we get underway, a reminder. These conversations are often difficult and can be upsetting. They're raw and they can be honest. So if you need support, please press pause and get some help. You'll find all the details for Mikey's Line and Suicide Prevention Scotland in the show notes to this podcast. I'm Dan Holland, and this is Speaking of Suicide. Haylis, we'll come on and talk about the campaign later in our conversation, but what brought you to be working in suicide prevention?
I guess a whole host of events, Dan, but probably one that started with the loss of my uncle to suicide when I was 16 years old. And my Uncle Joe was, I guess, more of a big brother figure than an uncle in my life. And obviously at the age of 16, that had quite a big impact on me, yeah.
Tell me a wee bit about your Uncle Joe. You describe him as a big brother to you. What sort of uncle was he like? What sort of person was he?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's now 30 years since we lost Joe, so my memories are maybe not as sharp as they once were rather. So I remember Joe was incredibly tall, and I remember him being really tall, and whether he was actually that tall or whether that's just how I remember him. He was always fun. He was, he would spend time playing with us. I'm one of 4 girls, so I had 3 younger sisters. And, he would spend time, I remember him playing with, he had a set of Matchbox cars that he kept in a case, but we would play with them. We would play with his spirograph and spend hours drawing pictures with his spirograph. I guess the things that my mum and dad probably disliked the most was he taught me how to eat a Jaffa cake by licking the chocolate off and peeling the orange out the middle and then eating the sponge and then eating the orange, and likewise with any custard cream or bourbon to scrape the top of the biscuit off and lick the cream out. Things that I'm sure my mum and dad didn't particularly appreciate. But yeah, he was a fun person to be around from what I remember.
It sounds like you were very close to him.
Yeah, and again, I don't know whether the years that have gone by make that feel more than it was, but certainly my memories were that Joe was around our house, and around our life a lot. We are, a big close family of sort of aunties and uncles and grandparents were always a big part of our lives as we grew up. Joe was the youngest of 4 kids. My dad was the oldest, and there was quite a big age gap between the two of them. So, Joe spent time with us. My grandparents often looked after us when my mum and dad both worked shifts. So my mum was a nurse, my dad was a police officer. So, we were often at our grandparents', and Joe still lived at home for most of my childhood. So he was always there. I'm sure we were probably quite annoying as far as he was concerned, but for us he was just somebody fun to have around.
I might be surprised. I would be surprised, I suspect, if a man would speak to their 16-year-old niece about difficulties with their mental health, or if they had suicidal thoughts. And perhaps this is what this new campaign would like to encourage more people to do. But in what you've learned in the years since Joe died, did he speak to anyone about his mental health at all, had anyone brought it up with him?
I don't think so. I think hindsight's a great thing, isn't it? I look back and I remember Joe in the weeks leading up to his death coming to visit when my mum and dad were both working, and I was at home, when there was that kind of crossover of them both being out the house at the same time before one came home again. And I remember Joe coming to speak and just be in the house, and I don't know if that was him, coming to say his goodbyes kind of thing. I know from having spoken to one of my other cousins that he did a similar thing with my other uncle and that side of the family. He was at their house, in the lead up to his death. So I don't know if that was him trying to talk or if that was him saying his goodbyes. I guess, it's hard to tell. And, we're talking back in the 80s when it was probably even harder to talk about mental health and suicide than it is now. So, how did you start those conversations as a young man in that day and age? I don't know, but I know that he had a very, very close friend, Colin, that, the two of them had spent holidays and things together, and it came as a complete shock to Colin that Joe had died. And, when Colin told lots of stories after Joe's funeral of all the antics and daft stuff that they got up to. He was Coco and Joe was Hosey, so they were kind of thick as thieves. So, but he didn't mention then that Joe had tried to talk to him about anything. So, yeah, I guess you would hope that things had changed. I know it's still very difficult for people to talk. That's why we have this campaign now. But certainly back then, I think it was even more difficult to talk about mental health.
How did your wider family respond to Joe's death? Because it was very different times then, wasn't it?
Yeah, and we were a Catholic family too, so there was obviously the challenge of it being seen as a sin in the Catholic Church. I think everybody was just really shocked and surprised that this had happened. I don't think my mum and dad, and they would say now they feel like they didn't handle it well for myself and my sisters. I don't think they knew how to. I don't think anybody really knew how to talk about it. Talk to us as children about what had happened. I was the oldest grandchild, if you like, so at 16 everybody else, all my other cousins and my sisters were younger than me, so I think they weren't sure how to, but I am, I'd always say to my parents they're being very hard on themselves, because what I do remember is that they always kind of said from then on, it's important to talk about how you're feeling, and to tell us what's going on in your lives. I think they've possibly lived to regret that in some respects, having 4 daughters who've been through a lot of different stuff. But, very much that this was, it was safe and there was nothing that we couldn't kind of talk to them about.
How did losing someone so close to you as a teenager, which we all know are very, very formative years for young people. But how did it affect you personally?
I don't think I was even really aware of the word suicide or what it meant until it happened. And I do remember thinking, watching the utter devastation that happened round about me, that, people just distraught by losing somebody to suicide. And I always remember just thinking, I don't want anybody else to feel like Joe did. And I don't want any other family to go through what we were going through. And so, yeah, I guess, I'd always wanted to be a nurse. And I went into nursing and injured my back. And so I couldn't carry on being a nurse. But alongside all of that, I've volunteered as a Samaritan, and I, wanted to do something that made a difference to people. I went back to university and did psychology and sociology when I finished my nurse training, and I guess the timing of things just worked. That when I finished that degree, the national strategy, the Choose Life strategy in Scotland came to life, was published, and that just, there were opportunities then for me to go and work in our local council in the Borders at the time, and to lead that work then. And I don't think I would have been working in suicide prevention for the last 20 years had Joe not died by suicide. If my life hadn't been touched by suicide, then I can't have seen a sort of pathway into that work any other way. So it certainly has shaped my career. And I think it shaped me as a person. It shaped me as a friend, as a sister, as a daughter, as a mum. My girls know that they can come and speak to me about anything, and there's no judgment, and we can talk things through and work things through. And so I think it had. I can't imagine I'd be the same person now had I not had that experience as a teenager.
And so we'll come and talk about the campaign in just 1 second. But in what way do you think it's changed you as a person? So I'm interested, you say you're talking about your daughters there, and encouraging young people to talk about their mental health is something that we know we need to try and do, and we are doing more of in Scotland. But I wonder how else you feel it's changed you as a person today.
I think I am. Well, my husband always says that I have to speak to everybody, and I'm just really, there's a man, Kevin Hines, that many people are aware of in the suicide prevention world, who attempted suicide from the Golden Gate Bridge, and talks about his experience as he was walking to the bridge, and how he just wanted one person to smile and one person to stop and ask him if he was okay. And so I smile and say hello to everybody I pass. I think I guess it's hard to tell. Is this because of Joe dying, or is it because I'm just that kind of person anyway? It's hard to tell, but I'm try to be very non-judgmental, that people can come and speak to me about stuff, and I will take the time to listen. I think it's really important, if people are struggling and they've reached out to you, that you take that time. I try to be as kind and caring and compassionate as I can possibly be. Another big piece of work that we are doing under the national strategy is around our time, space, compassion approach. And, that's something I've embodied, I think, my whole life, to try and give people the time and the space and the compassion when they need it. I'm sure there are times when I'm not like that. We all have our own, difficulties. And when I'm under pressure, maybe I'm not quite as good as I would like to be. But yeah, I think it's probably made me a more empathic, kinder, more compassionate person than I might have otherwise been.
Let's turn to talk about the Suicide Prevention Scotland's newest campaign. It's based on all of the latest information and understanding of suicide in Scotland. But what is the overall trend for suicide rates in Scotland at the moment?
So I guess over the last couple of years, we've seen an increase in suicide rates, which is kind of against the trend of a sort of downward trend over the early part of the 2000s. And I guess that's against the sort of backdrop of all the challenges that, people have faced over the last few years of COVID and lockdowns and cost of living crisis and all the things that I guess we know can be contributing factors to suicide, have been ever present in people's lives. Climate change, wars, and all the challenges that people face. So yeah, I hope that through the campaign and through all the other work that we are doing under the national strategy, that we will start to see a reverse of that, slightly upward trajectory that we've seen over the last couple of years in terms of the number of people who've taken their own life, recognising that any death is awful for that individual and for all the people around them.
You've talked very openly, Haylis, about your own personal experiences, but how is this campaign using lived experiences to help tell the story, but also the importance of having conversations about suicide?
Yeah, I just want to start, Dan, by saying, publicly and on this podcast, how incredibly grateful we are to all the people with lived and living experience who've helped to shape this campaign, and particularly our 4 ambassadors, as we've been calling them, who feature in the campaign: Laura, Ross, Claire and Shona, for sharing their stories. And, we recognise that, continually seeing your face on the back of a bus or on a roadside billboard somewhere, is not always an easy thing to do when you've been through an experience like, suicide loss. The whole campaign, though, was co-designed with, a much wider group of people with lived and living experience. And I think that's really important. Lived and living experience plays a huge part, along with our academic evidence and data and practice evidence, in shaping all the work that we do. But, I think when it comes to a public-facing campaign, being really clear about what people with lived and living experience want to see to help create change, and to encourage more people to talk about suicide. I think that was really critical in this piece of work. So, going along and being guided by them through a really, robust co-design process, which, I'm sitting in Electrify's office now, so it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge their huge part in doing that in a really sensitive and compassionate way as well, and getting the product that we believe is right and is making, beginning to make a difference from what you can gather from the statistics so far. I think we've always, I guess, had a sort of, what's the word the sort of strapline of suicide prevention is everybody's business, and it's good to talk. But I think really hearing those 4 people's stories about how important talking about suicide was, and how it's not some big scary thing that you need to be a psychologist or psychiatrist to have that conversation, that just being a friend who will take the time to listen, to take time to go and do something with that person, to think, to ask about suicide. I think these are really important messages to get out into the public.
You've clearly reached a point yourself, Haylis, where you're comfortable talking about your own experiences. Do you think perhaps that it might have helped you as a teenage girl to have been in a society or an environment where these sort of conversations were more open and more comfortable?
Yeah, I guess.
And I recognise hindsight's an imperfect science, and we don't have it at the time there to help us.
We don't have it at the time, but it was the day that Joe died, my mum and dad, I think, wanted to sort of keep everything as normal as possible, and encouraged me to go out and be with my pals. And I had a boyfriend at the time who, we had a big group of friends, and I don't think any of them could really understand. And I remember one of the boys at the time made quite a crass joke, because I don't think he really believed that Joe had died by suicide. He didn't know him, but I just think it was such a sort of unknown topic for us as a group of 16, 17-year-old teenagers. And that, that comment really stuck with me, not because I was angry with him or anything, but just because I thought nobody believes this, because we just don't talk about it. And, would it have made things easier? Possibly, had we talked about it, suicide being a potential beforehand. I know there are boys that I was at school with who have since gone on to die by suicide. And I wish we had spoken more openly about it before Joe died. I certainly didn't stop talking about it after Joe died. Yeah. Not because I was on any great crusade or anything, but I just thought it was part of my life, and it would have been impossible for me. I'm a talker, so it would have been impossible for me not to talk about it. But yeah, I think I've watched, as I say, my children have grown up with me working in suicide prevention, so they're very used to talking about suicide, and I know they've spoken to friends and people who've around them who've been struggling with their mental health, and they're not afraid to have those conversations, and I see things very differently for them than it was for me.
What do we know back in today about the high risk categories at the moment, or people at higher risk of suicide, from the research that's helped shape this campaign? Yeah.
So we know there are certain groups of people who are more at risk of suicide. We know that 3/4 of all suicide deaths are men, and predominantly men within their middle years. We know that if you live in one of the lowest socioeconomic groups, you are at 3 times greater risk than if you live in the highest socioeconomic group. So we know poverty has a big impact. We know that for transition periods where people are going through, whether that's transitions from primary to secondary school, from secondary school to university, or whether it's a transition in adulthood where you perhaps our relationships come to an end, or you're changing jobs or something like that those are, I guess, challenging times for people. I guess, though, it's important to remember that suicide can happen to anybody. And, whilst it's really important that we, look at those, what we describe as inequalities in suicide where we know there is a higher risk, it's also really important to not forget that this could be anybody. I've had, points in my life where, I've just thought, God, if I just drove my car off the side of the road here, that would be the end of all these difficulties. I wouldn't, I know to stop and talk to people at those times, and I have done, but it can happen to anybody, and I think we need to be aware of that too.
I was struck in particular by a line on the Suicide Prevention Scotland website that talked about isolation being a high risk factor for people, and yes, there's physical isolation in the geography of our country and within communities in urban areas and across rural areas, but this focused on isolation through neurodivergence as a huge risk factor as well. What do we know about the specific risk factors if someone is neurodivergent?
Yeah, so I think it would be fair to say, Dan, that we don't know as much as we probably need to know about it. I think it's an area where we know we are kind of lacking in evidence, but I guess for a number of reasons, one is neurodivergence is vastly underdiagnosed, and I think particularly in older generations. So, it wasn't so much of a thing when I was a child that people were, diagnosed with autism or ADHD, and yet, I would imagine the prevalence is as high for my generation as it would be now for children and young people who are more able to get a diagnosis, although recognising there are still challenges around that. So that, I think that's a big factor. Under diagnosis in the adult population is probably still quite high, and so people are therefore struggling with their own challenges, not realising or understanding why. So I guess that that's one reason why we don't understand as much about suicide risk for that population. And I guess the other is that there just hasn't been the level of research into neurodiversity as we have seen in other areas. We do know that loneliness and isolation is a factor in, causing an increase in suicide. Right, whether you are neurodivergent or not. And, I guess you've talked about the sort of geographic isolation that people can experience, but we know that people can feel lonely in a crowded room if they
Absolutely.
don't feel like they fit in. And I know from my own experience of having people with neurodivergence around me in my life that, that is a big factor. If you don't feel like you fit in and you're part of, I guess, normal society, and in inverted commas, whatever normal society actually is, then that can be really difficult. So it is an area that we are, we're very aware of. It's an area that we are, beginning to look at in more detail, and hopefully we'll build our understanding. We've had a few sort of conversation cafe style sessions at some of the events we've run, just to build our understanding again from people with lived and living experience, so that we're learning from them as much as we're learning from the academic evidence as well.
I know there is no one fix-all solution to this, and the very nature of neurodivergence is we're all very, very different. But if we know someone who has neurodivergence of one form or another, and we're worried about them, is there any best practice that, as friends, loved ones, people who care about them, can do to help support them with their mental health? Anything in particular?
I mean, I think it's the same for anybody, you know, who might be struggling with their mental health. We are all different, and you know what we each need in that space is very different. But you know, I referred earlier to our time-space compassion work, and you know, that certainly that came out of, I guess, an assumption that we could create a model around crisis that we could then replicate all across the country. And what we heard from people was there was no one model that fitted everybody in the country, but that the things that we kept hearing from people that we spoke to, whether they were people with lived experience of, you know, experience in suicide, or whether they were practitioners working in mental health or, you know, wider services, was those three words of time, space and compassion. And so that's the approach that we advocate, and we advocate that approach for anybody who is struggling with their mental health, you know, just to take the time in a space that they feel comfortable in, you know, show them compassion, ask them directly about suicide. And I think that's really important, you know, from my experience of living and working with people with neurodivergence. You know, direct questions will get you a direct answer, and you know, so don't be frightened to ask that direct question about suicide, and then just be there to listen and accept that what they are telling you they need is what they need, and you know, they will know best.
And asking those direct questions is something that we can do with everyone we care about or we're worried about, isn't it? But one of the myths that I hear repeated again and again is that people are worried about asking those direct questions for the fear of putting the thought of suicide into someone's head and then that having other implications. But can you dispel some of these myths for us, Haylis? Is it, you know, asking anybody who you're worried about that direct question of, are you thinking about suicide? Have you had suicidal thoughts? Actually bringing that conversation into the open, how much of a difference can that make to someone?
I don't think we can underestimate how important it is for us to do that for people. Suicide is a difficult word to say. It's difficult to ask that question. And I guess, you know, if it's difficult to ask the question, you can only imagine how much more difficult it is if you're the person thinking about suicide to actually walk up to somebody and say, I'm thinking about suicide. So I think, you know, it's a real gift to give somebody if you are concerned about them, to ask them directly about suicide. But, you know, I just always think the worst that's going to happen is that they say no and you've got it wrong, but it's better to have got it wrong in that circumstance than to be proven right in the future. I've never had anybody be angry at me for asking that question. You know, I usually if they say no, then you know, I've got a reason for asking. It's not that it's just a question I've asked out the blue. It's usually because I'm concerned about something. There is no way of putting that idea in somebody's head if it's not already there. We are just not that easily persuaded as human beings. You know, nobody's going to persuade me to give them my salary for the rest of my life. So, you know, they're certainly not going to put the idea of suicide into my head just by asking me the question. So, you know, I think it is a myth, and, it's so important to just ask, to be confident and ask, and to know that you don't have to be some kind of therapist if you ask that question. Mm-hmm. If you've asked, it's probably because you're concerned about somebody, and all you really need to do then is just take some time to listen if they do say yes, and to, you know, ask them what's going on, what's brought them to feel like that. And often that is enough to help somebody to stay alive.
And just letting them know that there is somebody there who cares.
who cares? Absolutely, yeah.
So much effort in our society is, and I use this word very carefully, about trying to fix the individual. But how much do we actually need to look at the support systems themselves, the network of effort that goes in to help people, and I'm not going to use the fix word now, to help people, and make these resources more joined up, better funded, more personalised, and recognise that we are all very, very different in our own way? Do we need to turn things on their head a little bit?
Yeah, and I guess, you know, our strategy and action plan is attempting to do that. There are not many actions that are about the individual fixing themselves. There's lots of, you know, actions about making sure that, you know, wherever you are, you get the right help and support that you need in the right way, that we have, you know, people who are skilled and knowledgeable across the system, you know, who, and I use that system as society as a whole, you know, our sort of whole of government, whole society approach that we're taking is in trying to make those changes right across government and society, that it's not just about what the individual can do for themselves. I remember speaking to a young girl once who had lots of support systems in place, but she felt that they weren't all working together and they were still only interested in what had happened to her in that week, rather than, you know, understanding her whole life and you know, how that had brought her to feel as she did. And, you know, I think that's really important. That's certainly, you know, a journey that we've gone on as Suicide Prevention Scotland over the last couple of years, to really build our understanding of, you know, how things like stigma and discrimination have affected, you know, generations of people, and how therefore it becomes very difficult for you as an individual to make changes when that whole system is I guess, you know, not set up or not designed to help you when you need it in the way that you need it. So yeah, you know, it can't just be down to the individual. I think we all have a role to play in that, and I guess that is, you know, I'll come back to, you know, the line that we say that suicide prevention is everyone's business. We can all play a part in that.
And finally, then, Haylis, where can people find out more and watch and listen to the stories that form this campaign, but also, if they're worried about someone, help them learn about how they can start these conversations?
Yeah, so we, along with the campaign in April, we launched our new website as well, so suicideprevention.scot, and, you know, all those resources are available. We're building that, you know, as we speak. There are new pages being added, but certainly if you're somebody who's concerned about somebody else, there's lots of information on there about, you know, where you can get support, where you can, you know, how you ask those questions, some videos and learning resources that will help you do that. If you're somebody who's concerned about your own thoughts of suicide, then again there's information on the site there to help, and, you know, we're in the process of building a page for professionals so that people working in suicide prevention have access to the most up-to-date data and evidence to support their practice as well.
And as I said at the top of this podcast, there is a link to the Suicide Prevention Scotland website in the show notes of this podcast. Haylis, thank you so much for talking to me today about your Uncle Joe and the What If a Conversation About Suicide Could Save a Life campaign.
Thank you, Dan.
Now, here's Shona from Mikey's Line with a few thoughts to take away from our conversation today.
Yeah, really great to hear from Haylis there, and both her lived and living experience of suicide through losing her uncle, and the way that this has affected her as a as a human and in her professional life. And really hearing that also in this campaign from Suicide Prevention Scotland, that kind of as a country, we want to, or from a governmental perspective and as individuals, we do want to have a commitment to making time, space and compassion so that people that are struggling with suicidal thoughts, suicidal behaviour, that they can be met not with a professional face or with a system that they feel that they can't navigate, but that they can be met with such care and compassion. And this idea of all of us having a part in that, if we can have the courage as individuals, that if we meet someone that we feel is struggling, that we can ask them with compassion, are you feeling suicidal? Are you having suicidal thoughts? And us realising that that is what makes the difference. It's not that we're just doing that as a placeholder until they can get the help, but that is the help. Us with open, kind hearts, even if we're fumbling through the questions and feeling awkward, when we're doing that from that place of love and compassion, that is what is part of making the difference. So I guess I'm saying that to myself as much as anybody else listening, that we can do this. We can have these courageous conversations. And thanks to Haylis for showing us that through her story as well as through this campaign.
A huge thanks to Shona and all the team at Mikey's Line for the work they do. And don't forget, if you need someone to talk to or some help, then you can text Mikey's Line on 07786 20 7755. That's 07786 20 7755. Or contact them via Messenger, web chat and WhatsApp. And the number for WhatsApp is 01463 729 000. You can visit them at The Hive, 4 Struthers Lane, Inverness. They're open 7 days a week from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. And all those details and links are in the show notes too. Speaking of Suicide is funded by Mikey's Line, and the platform is sponsored by Highland-based family firm D&D Paving. If you'd like to sponsor an episode, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Speaking of Suicide is produced by Adventurous Audio Limited.